On March 15th, nearly 2 weeks into her stay, Jessica made a phone call to Sean. It started out quiet, emotional. Then the conversation escalated. The two of them got into an argument, and that call ended with a breakup. The relationship that had dominated her world for the past year was suddenly over. Jessica was crushed. The breakup hit her hard, not just because she loved Sean, but because he had been her escape from everything else in her life. After hanging up the phone, she felt overwhelmed, sad, maybe even lost. She needed to get out, breathe, clear her mind. There was a nearby shopping mall, just a short bus ride away. Jessica had been there once before and knew how to get there on her own. So she told one of her friends at Huckleberry House where she was going, just to be safe, and then she left, quietly, heading for the bus stop. That would be the last time anyone would see Jessica Keene alive. 11 p.m. That night, the house staff were doing their routine check to make sure all the girls were in the house and they were ready for bed. However, when they got to Jessica's room, she wasn't there. When the staff at Huckleberry House discovered that Jessica was missing from her room, they didn't waste time. Their first instinct was to reach out to her parents, hoping maybe, somehow, Jessica had decided to go home. Maybe it had all been miscommunication. Maybe she was just upset after the breakup and needed comfort. Her mother, Rebecca, answered the call. It had been a while since she'd spoken to Jessica, even longer since they'd had a good, calm conversation. But when the staff asked if her daughter was with her, Rebecca's heart dropped. Jessica hadn't been in contact at all. She didn't know anything. And in that moment, something shifted. A sense of panic crept in. This wasn't like a rebellious outburst. This felt wrong. Within hours of Jessica's disappearance, Rebecca was on the phone with police, filing a missing person report. The timeline was already troubling. Jessica had last been seen just before sunset, around 6 o'clock or 6:30 p.m., standing at a nearby bus stop, waiting to catch a ride to the mall. A familiar trip, a small escape to clear her mind. After that, there were no sightings. Not on the bus, not at the mall, not anywhere. Now it was close to midnight. 6 hours had passed. She could be anywhere. Police were hesitant at first. Teenagers disappear all the time, they told themselves, especially those with a history of skipping class, ignoring curfews, or sneaking around. And Jessica, on paper, fit that mold. But there was a flaw in that theory. Jessica had changed. Her time at Huckleberry House hadn't been long, but it had been transformative. She'd been respectful, calm, cooperative. She followed the rules. There were no warning signs that she was slipping back into old habits. More importantly, her relationship with Sean, the main trigger for her behavior, was over. And she'd been honest. She told her friend where she was going. Not her parents, not the staff, but a friend she trusted. Why would she lie to someone she saw every day, someone who knew her routine? Police began talking to people, friends, staff at the house, Jessica's family, trying to map out possibilities. But with so little to go on, the working theory became the one that seemed most plausible on the surface. Maybe she had run away. Rebecca was devastated by that suggestion. She insisted it wasn't true. Jessica wouldn't do that. Not now, not after everything. She might have talked about running away in the past, Rebecca said, but she never meant it. She didn't have a plan. She wouldn't just vanish. Still, police had to follow protocol. Even if they believed Rebecca, and many of them did, Jessica had a history that couldn't be ignored. They had to treat the case as if it was a runaway. And if she had run off, they needed to figure out the most likely place she'd go. When they asked friends and family who Jessica would turn to in a moment like this, if she needed someone or if she had left by choice, every answer was the same. Sean Thompson. Yes, they'd broken up just hours earlier. But maybe that was all the more reason she'd go to him. Maybe she was heartbroken. Maybe she wanted closure. Maybe she believed, even then, that they could fix what had fallen apart. The theory began to form. Maybe Jessica had arranged to meet Sean at the mall that night. Maybe they reconnected. Maybe they ran off together. Or maybe, just maybe, she went back to his house. While police planned to question Sean Thompson as soon as they could, there was still a small part of them, and of her family, that held on to hope. Maybe this wasn't something dark. Maybe Jessica had just gone off on her own for a few hours. Maybe she'd come back when she was ready, explain it all, and everyone could breathe again. They didn't want to jump to the worst-case scenario. Not yet. But that hope would be shattered just 2 days later. On the morning of March 17th, 1991, a man was walking through Foster Chapel Cemetery, a quiet, old graveyard nearly 20 miles from Huckleberry House. It was peaceful, still, until he saw something in the distance, half concealed by weathered headstones and overgrown grass. As he got closer, the shape became heartbreakingly clear. It was the body of Jessica Keene. She was almost completely naked. The only clothing left on her body was a single sock and her bra, which had been twisted unnaturally as though it had been yanked, pulled, or torn in a struggle. Everything else was gone. At first glance, it was already clear to investigators that this hadn't been a simple or quick act of violence. Jessica had been brutally beaten. There were severe injuries to her head, deep, devastating wounds that left no doubt she'd been bludgeoned. That was later confirmed in the autopsy. Jessica's skull had been fractured from the sheer force of the blows. She'd also suffered dozens of smaller injuries across her body, scratches, bruises, cuts, likely the result of struggling, running, and fighting back. The forensic pathologist also confirmed what many feared. Jessica had been raped before she was murdered. Her toxicology results showed no signs of drugs or alcohol. She had been completely sober when she died. The most heartbreaking detail, though, was that it wouldn't have taken much force to kill her. A few of the blows alone would have ended her life. But her attacker kept going, even after she was gone. And the weapon used to kill her? It was a tombstone. Someone, her killer, had pulled a full headstone from the earth, a massive 70-pound slab of stone, and they had used it to strike Jessica in the head. The force was so intense that the tombstone split in two. One half of it was found lying near her body, soaked in blood. Crime scene investigators walked the grounds, piecing together what had happened, and what they found painted a horrifying picture. Jessica had been running, naked, desperate, terrified. She had tried to escape her attacker. She made it deep into the cemetery, zigzagging between graves, footprints scattered everywhere, all matching her size. Near the entrance of the cemetery, they found her other sock, perhaps flung off in a frantic sprint. And behind one of the weathered old headstones, they discovered 2 clear knee prints pressed into the damp soil. Jessica had been hiding there, crouched behind the grave, trying to stay quiet, trying to outlast whatever horror was chasing her. She was fighting for her life until the very end. With the horror of the crime scene still fresh in their minds, detectives turned their attention to a question that often haunts cases like this. Why? There was, without a doubt, a sexual motive. Jessica had been raped, she was found naked, and the scene bore all the signs of a sexually driven crime. But was it the only reason she was killed? Was this a planned, targeted attack? Had someone specifically sought Jessica out? Or had she simply crossed paths with the wrong person at the worst possible time? A predator looking for any young girl? Investigators knew they had to look at all possibilities. And one thing they were able to rule out fairly quickly was robbery. Jessica was still wearing her watch. She still had rings on her fingers, some jewelry still intact. If theft had been the goal, it made no sense that those things were left untouched. Still, one of her close friends pointed something out to police that gave them pause. Jessica had been wearing a specific necklace, one that Sean Thompson had given her. It was gold-plated, simple, and had a word hanging from the chain, taken. A word that, to Jessica, had symbolized her commitment to Sean. But now it was gone. It was possible, of course, that she had taken it off herself. After all, she and Sean had just broken up that very day. Maybe she didn't want the reminder anymore, but there was no way to know for sure. And the fact that only that necklace was missing felt deliberate. Whether it had been removed by Jessica or taken by her killer, police had to treat it as potential evidence. So now, the priority became mapping out the timeline. What exactly had happened between the moment Jessica left Huckleberry House and the moment her body was discovered in that distant graveyard? Nearly 20 miles away, the last confirmed sighting of Jessica was at the bus stop around 6 p.m. on March 15th. She was heading to the mall, or at least, that's what she told her friend before she left. But after that moment, no one saw her again. Not on the bus, Not the mall. Nothing. Which meant something had likely happened before she ever made it to her destination. Had she even gotten on that bus? Or had someone intercepted her? Detectives began building their most likely theory. They believed that Jessica had been approached at the bus stop. Someone had pulled up, possibly someone she recognized. Maybe even someone who offered her a ride to the mall. Someone she trusted. Or maybe not. Maybe she was forced in. Or coerced. Either way, the theory was that she ended up in a car, driven far away from Columbus to West Jefferson. They believed Jessica was held captive in that vehicle for several hours, during which she was undressed, assaulted, and brutalized. And then at some point, something shifted. Jessica saw an opportunity. She fought back. She escaped. Alone, terrified, and likely still unclothed, Jessica ran as fast as she could. She made it to a rural dirt path, one that led straight to Foster Chapel Cemetery. There was a farmhouse not far from there, and police believe Jessica may have seen a light on. Maybe she was trying to reach it, desperate to find safety. A door knock on, a person to help, but she didn't make it. They believe Jessica had been running in total darkness, blind in the pitch-black night, with nothing but her fear to guide her steps. Somewhere along that desperate sprint through the cemetery, she lost her second sock. The first had already come off near the entrance, a chilling breadcrumb marking the beginning of her escape. Her bare feet hit the cold, uneven earth as she zigzagged between gravestones, trying anything she could to stay ahead of the person chasing her. Some reports claim she even leapt over a fence at some point, though where exactly this could have been is unclear. What they do know is that she made it into the graveyard, and her sock near the entrance confirmed it. The details of her route, where she turned, how long she kept running, whether she screamed or stayed silent, will forever remain unknown. But one thing was heartbreakingly clear. Jessica didn't give up. She fought to live until her last breath. Investigators believe that during this frantic escape, Jessica collided with something, a gatepost, most likely. Maybe she didn't see it coming in the dark. Maybe she was too focused on what was behind her to notice what was ahead. Either way, the impact was enough to knock her down. She tried to scramble back to her feet, tried to push through the pain and keep moving, but that moment of hesitation, that brief stumble, gave her attacker the opening they needed. And they took it. At that point, the killer clearly decided that there was no point in trying to drag her back to the car. Whatever original plan they had was over. They were going to finish it right there. Using pure brute strength, they ripped one of the heavy tombstones out of the ground, a 70-pound slab of stone that had been deeply embedded in the earth for years, maybe decades. These headstones aren't just placed on top of graves. They're anchored, sealed into the ground with weight and permanence. But the killer managed to free it, and with a horrifying amount of force, they brought it down on Jessica's head. The tombstone cracked in two from the impact. But that wasn't the end of it. The killer continued, using one of the broken halves to beat her over and over again, well past the point of death. It was a savage, merciless attack. And then, once it was done, they left her there, alone in the dark, in a graveyard. 2 days later, her broken body would be found by a man passing through the cemetery. When police spoke to Jessica's mother about Sean Thompson, they didn't get a glowing review. Understandably so. All Rebecca Keene had seen was her daughter spiraling out of control ever since Sean entered her life. From her perspective, he had stolen Jessica from her, changed her, pulled her away from everything she used to love. And now, Jessica was dead. Naturally, detectives began considering Sean as a potential suspect. The motive was there. Maybe he hadn't taken the breakup well. Maybe he didn't want to break up at all and thought he could convince Jessica to come back. Maybe things escalated. Maybe the anger boiled over. Maybe he felt entitled to Jessica, like she belonged to him. And when she tried to walk away, he lashed out in the most violent way imaginable. And there was that necklace, too. The only piece of jewelry missing from her body. The one that Sean had given her. The one that said taken. Now that she wasn't his anymore, maybe he took it back. So, police wasted no time tracking down Sean Thompson. From everything they knew so far, he had been the obvious suspect, the one unstable figure in Jessica's life, the one person who had both motive and opportunity. They needed to talk to him face to face. But when detectives finally sat down with him, they hit a wall almost immediately. Sean hadn't even been in Ohio on the night Jessica was killed. He and several of his friends had taken a short trip to Florida that same weekend. Investigators asked for any documentation, receipts, tickets, photographs, timestamps, anything that could prove their whereabouts. And one by one, every single person in that group provided it. They had timestamp proof that they were hundreds of miles away when Jessica disappeared. Still, to be absolutely certain, police requested a DNA sample from Sean. They wanted to test it against the DNA found on Jessica's body. This was their best lead, their one clear theory. If this came back negative, then what? The results were conclusive. Sean's DNA wasn't a match. Sean Thompson had nothing to do with Jessica's murder. And just like that, the case was suddenly empty again. The one person they were sure had played a role ruled out. All his friends, too. Every single one of them was cleared. It was frustrating, not just because they had lost a suspect, but because they had been so convinced. Sean had come into Jessica's life like a storm, pulling her away from school, her passions, her family. And now she was dead. Everything about it looked right, or at least fit, but it wasn't him. And once he was ruled out, the foundation of the investigation began to crumble. Because the truth was, there wasn't anyone else. Jessica didn't surround herself with bad influences. Her other friends were sweet, quiet, hardworking kids, just like she had been. There was no suspicious boyfriend, no dangerous adult in her life. No one stands out, no one with motive, no one is obvious. So where did they go from there? The only clue left was the distance. Jessica's body was found 20 miles from where she was last seen, a huge gap that raised more questions than answers. Police began to wonder, what if the killer wasn't someone from her inner circle at all? What if this wasn't personal? What if this was about opportunity? Maybe the killer lived out in that rural area where her body was found. Maybe they had been driving through, noticed Jessica alone at the bus stop, and decided at that moment to strike. Maybe they lured her into the car with a lie, or forced her. And maybe the cemetery wasn't chosen randomly either. Maybe it was close to where they lived. Familiar ground. And if that theory was right, then this wasn't a targeted crime. It wasn't about Jessica specifically. It was about someone who was looking for a girl. And that made things far more terrifying. Because if this killer had acted on impulse, if they'd abducted Jessica simply because the opportunity presented itself, then there was a strong chance they would do it again. They could already have done it before. There might be other girls, other victims, other families who never got answers. The police were afraid of that. The community was afraid too. Jessica's case flooded the local news. Her photo was everywhere, smiling, youthful, full of life. Crime Stoppers offered a $3,000 reward for any information leading to an arrest, and as her loved ones raised more funds, that number grew. Thousands of people were watching, waiting, hoping for a lead. But there was nothing. With Sean ruled out, the case had no suspects, no solid theories, and worst of all, no momentum. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The police were left grasping at air, with no clues to point them in any direction. And before long, the case of Jessica Keene's murder became a cold case. In the years after Jessica Keene's murder, her case never truly left the desks of detectives. It lingered quietly but persistently in the background. Every time there was a new case involving a young girl attacked or assaulted within 30 miles of West Jefferson, investigators would pull out Jessica's file. They would spread it open across the table, page by page, line by line, comparing the new case to hers. Was the victim the same age? Were the injuries similar? Did the location match? Could this be the same person? But every time, nothing fit. No connection ever seemed to hold. Patterns refused to emerge. No suspect was ever tied to both cases. Jessica's murder remained completely isolated, like a single dark dot on a blank map. A crime that refused to belong to any known narrative. No other murder or assault seemed to echo it. And yet, investigators refused to give up, because there was still that one piece of evidence. The DNA. Now, with most cold cases that involve DNA, there's still a thread of hope that never quite breaks. Because every year, thousands of new DNA profiles are added to criminal databases. Maybe the original killer had never been arrested before. Maybe that's why no match came up at the time. But what if they had committed another crime since then? What if now, all these years later, their DNA was sitting in the system, waiting to be matched? That's why it became common practice to periodically rerun those DNA samples, especially as forensic science improved. And then came a major turning point. A law passed in the late 1990s or early 2000s that required every violent offender to provide a DNA sample, whether their case had required DNA testing or not. The goal was simple: to catch repeat offenders, to solve future crimes, and maybe, just maybe, to crack some cold cases wide open. For those already in prison when the law was passed, their DNA was taken as they were released. Just a swab, just a signature, and it was filed away, logged, indexed. Jessica's case had always held on to that possibility, that one day this killer would be matched, that the person who had taken her life would end up in that database. And investigators made sure to recheck her DNA evidence every few years. And finally, it paid off. On March 17, 2008, exactly 17 years to the day that Jessica Keene's body had been found, the database lit up. A match. The DNA found at Jessica's crime scene matched a man who had just been released from prison after serving time for a violent crime. His name was Marvin Lee Smith Jr. Smith was 51 years old. From 1991 to 2000, he had served 9 years behind bars for the rape, kidnapping, and robbery of 2 other young girls. It turned out, the law that required DNA collection from violent criminals had gone into effect while he was still incarcerated. And for inmates like Smith, they were swabbed on their way out. So in the year 2000, as he walked out of prison, his DNA was collected and added to the system. And then, 8 years later, in 2008, Jessica Keene's DNA sample was run again. And it matched his DNA thanks to this new law. Those 2 other attacks, the ones Marvin Lee Smith Jr. had already been convicted of, actually happened before Jessica Keene was murdered. That discovery hit investigators hard. It meant that Jessica hadn't been his first victim. He had a pattern, a clear escalation. He had already assaulted 2 young girls, been arrested for it, and yet he was back out on the streets. At the time of Jessica's murder, Marvin Smith wasn't just some stranger with no criminal history. He had already been charged. He had already stood before a judge. But for reasons tied to legal procedure, he'd been released on bond, a temporary release while awaiting trial for those previous assaults. And during that window of freedom, while still pending trial, he struck again. He found Jessica. Years later, when Smith was finally arrested and confronted with the DNA evidence in 2008, he gave a full confession. No games, no denials. He admitted to everything, every part of what happened to Jessica. Smith told investigators that he hadn't gone out that day planning to kill anyone. His words, cold and calculated, revealed that his intent had been to find a girl, sexually assault her, and then let her go. As horrifying as that is, in his mind, that was the extent of the plan. But something went wrong. Jessica got away. When she broke free and ran, barefoot and terrified into that cemetery, Smith knew the risk. If she made it to safety, she could report him. There would be a description, DNA, evidence. And because he was already out on bond, the consequences would be far more severe. Another arrest would mean a long prison sentence, likely for the rest of his life. So he made a brutal decision. He couldn't let her live. That was when he chased her through the graveyard, dragged her down, and silenced her forever beneath that shattered tombstone. He murdered Jessica to stop her from talking, to stop justice. But in the end, that very act became the thing that would eventually bring him down. In March of 2008, Marvin Lee Smith Jr. was arrested in connection with Jessica's murder. And luckily, he admitted to every single aspect of this case. He confessed to abducting Jessica, holding her hostage, raping her, and murdering her in 1991. And thankfully, this case could finally be put to rest. Given the sheer brutality of what happened to Jessica, the kidnapping, the rape, the cold-blooded murder of a 15-year-old girl, prosecutors immediately began preparing for a capital trial. Marvin Lee Smith Jr. would be facing the death penalty. And he knew it. To avoid that fate, Smith made the only move he had left. He pled guilty. Guilty to everything. Every single charge that had been waiting for him all these years. There would be no trial, no drawn-out court proceedings, no opportunity for his defense to twist the story. He admitted to it all, and for that, he was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison, with no chance of parole until 2038. By the time that year comes, Smith will be in his 80s, and even then, after everything, the chances of him ever walking free again are almost non-existent. The damage he caused, the pain he left behind, is simply too great to be forgiven or forgotten. Jessica's family, after nearly 2 decades of waiting and not knowing, were finally able to lay her to rest properly. They gave her a beautiful funeral, a quiet burial, and more than that, they gave her a space to be remembered. Right at the entrance of Foster Chapel Cemetery, where her body was found all those years ago, there now stands a cross. It bears her name, Jessica Lynn Keene. It's simple but powerful, and it's never empty. People who hear her story still visit that spot, still leave flowers, tokens, little gifts, quiet acknowledgement from strangers who never knew her but feel her loss just the same. That little memorial stands as a symbol, not just of Jessica's memory, but of justice, even if it took 17 long years to come. And that is all I have in this case. I think this has been a pretty short one, but I think it's really important to cover cases like this, cold cases that have eventually been solved many years later, because it gives hope to a lot of other cold cases that maybe one day, with advancements in technology, new laws, things like that, that a lot of cases can be solved and will be solved and justice will be served.